Hi guys, welcome to my channel DNM. So let's start today with the OSPF router ID. What is router ID? First question is what is router ID? Router ID is a 32-bit IP address assigned to every OSPF router. It can be manually or it can be automatically selected by the your OSPF enabled router. When I say 32-bit means it should be in a 32-bit IP address format like 1.1.1.1 or you can say 10.10.10.1. It could be anything, but it should be the 32-bit IP address. Now the question is how routers select the router ID. So there is an election process every OSPF router follow. Number one, when elections start to select the router ID by your OSPF router, the first it will check whether administrator has manually configured the router ID, means through command prompt. If administrator configure router ID by manually or by command, that IP address become a router ID immediately. Okay. Second stage, no, I do not have configured anything manually. Next is a loopback address. Loopback interface or you can say loopback address. So if on the router 1 example you have a loopback address or I can say loopback interface having IP address 172.16.1.1 slash 32 or anything. So what will happen? This loopback IP address become a router ID. Like, but if you have a multiple loopback interfaces, right? If you have a more than one loopback interfaces, right? So what will happen then? In this case, what will happen? So highest IP address of a loopback interface become a router ID, right? Highest IP address of loopback become a router ID if you have more than one loopback. If you do not have a manually configure router ID, you do not have any loopback. The third step is a highest IP address of active interface, right? Whatever active interface currently you have, in that case highest IP address from the active interface will become a router ID. So guys, tell me how many active interface do you have currently? Gigabyte 0/0 and gigabyte 0/1. Basically it's showing down, red means it's showing down. There are two interface configured on the router 1. So the highest IP address, if you compare with the gigabyte 0/0 IP address 10.1.1.1 and gigabyte 0/1 interface 1/1.1/24. So this IP address become a your router ID. Definitely you can manually override this third step by adding command or by configuring a loopback IP address. Clear? It's very simple. Router ID is a 32-bit IP address selected by your router. There are three election process. The one is manually. Second is loopback IP address. If you have a multiple loopback IP address, then highest IP address of loopback address become a router ID. But you do not have manual configuration. You do not have any loopback. The last stage is highest IP address of active become a active interface become a router ID. So let's do one thing. Let's focus on now practically. Let's test everything practically. Okay, open router 1. I have this router 1. Perfect. Enter, enable configuration terminal, then configure the interface gigabyte 0/1 IP address 172.1.1.1 255.255.255.0 and no shutdown. Perfect. Next interface I do have, that is interface gigabyte 0/0, then IP address 10.1.1.1, correct, and subnet mask 255.255.255.252. Okay, and interface no shutdown. So how many currently I have, how many interface currently I have? Show IP int brief. See, I have now gigabyte 0/0 and 0/1. gigabyte 0/0 having IP address 10.1.1.1 and gigabyte 0/1 having IP address 172.1.1.1. So which is the highest IP address? Of course, gigabyte 0/1 interface IP address is the highest IP address. But be make sure. What did I say? Highest IP address of the active interface. So active means both your link state protocol is also up and your administratively also up, means up. Interface should not be shut down. Your link should not be down. Okay, do one thing, then configure router 2 so that the link between the both router will come up. Enable configuration terminal interface gigabyte 0/0 IP address 10.1.10.1.1.2 255.255.255.252. Then no shutdown. No shutdown, right? Exit and then configure the LAN IP address. Interface gigabyte 0/1 IP address 172. What is the IP address? 172.20.1.1 255.255.255.0, and here you can say no shutdown. Now check, go and check the output of show IP anti-brief. Here you go now, guys. Up, up. Both should be up. Then only we can say active, right? Active interface. So now here you can go and just your interface 0/0/1 come up. Here status is up and previously it was a down. As soon as I hit, I configure this interface router to interface gigabyte 0/0 and set to no shutdown, then only my this link between these two router come up. Clear? So now let's go and configure the Ospf, right? So careful, highest IP address become a router ID, right? So let's not configure it manually. Then configure configuration terminal router Ospf 10 is a process ID. Then that's it. Let's configure router Ospf 10 only. Enter means you have just enabled the Ospf. Then look at the command show IP protocol. See here, you guys. Right, even though I have not yet any active neighbor, I have not yet advertised my connected LAN or link, I can say through network command or through IP OSPF process ID and area ID, but still immediately your router select the router ID. Why? As per the our previous discussion, highest IP address, right? Highest IP address become a router ID. Highest IP address of active physical interface become a router ID. Why? Because we do not have a manual, we do not have a loopback, we do not have a highest loopback, or we do not have a multiple loopback. Then go to the router 2, and configure the Ospf. Configuration terminal router Ospf 10. That's it. And now see, look at which IP address your router is picked as a router ID. Show IP protocol. So you have a two active interface, gigabyte 0/0, gigabyte 0/1. So 10 dot compared to 10.1.1.2, 172.20.1.1 is a highest IP address. Is a highest IP address. Perfect. So now this IP address 172.20.1.1 is now selected as a router ID. Okay. Do one thing. Let's configure the Ospf and area, and now see the router ID. Now this router ID become a neighbor ID when you say output of router 2. So router 1 router ID, you can see it in the router 2 as a neighbor ID. As a neighbor ID. Hmm, chalo. Then configuration terminal, interface, gigabyte, 0/0, IP OSPF process ID, area 0. Exit, we have one more interface which is 1, IP OSPF process ID 10, area ID 20. Correct, 20. Okay, then go and save the configuration. Go on router 1, configuration terminal, router OSPF 10. No, not here. Go to the interface, gigabyte 0/0, IP OSPF 10, area 10. Area 10. Oh, mismatch area ID. Why? Because in between these two link, right? In between these two link, we have a area 0. Now this interface gigabyte 0/0 now is a part of area 0, and now you have configured gigabyte 0/0 as a area 10. So it is showing area ID mismatch. So you have to go and change the area ID. Interface gigabyte 0/0, IP OSPF area, IP OSPF process ID 10, area 0. Clear? Okay, now go and let's check whether you have a neighborship. Okay, show IP OSPF neighbor. See guys, I can see the neighbor. On R1, I can see R2 as my neighbor. On R1, I can see R2 as my neighbor here. So on a router 1, we can see R2 as a neighbor, and on R2, I can see R1 as a neighbor. But so for us, it's very simple to say R1, R2. But for router, right, neighbor ID is a router ID. See now, this neighbor ID 172.20.1.1 is the router ID of router 2. Correct? Okay. Let's move on. Let's go and check the router 2 output. Show IP protocol. See, 172.20.1.1 is the IP address of router ID of router 2, which I can see as a neighbor ID here. Clear? So now go and change the router ID. Now there are two only options I have. First, let's create a loopback interface and see what will be the changes in the router ID. So on the router 1, configuration terminal, right? Now see guys, selection process has already been done. Neighborship is already formed between these two routers, right? So let's see what will be the impact if we will configure the loopback address, right? Currently, I don't see any impact. Okay. Interface loopback 1, IP address 1.1.1.1, 255.255.255.255. Clear? No shutdown. So now how many interface we do have? Show IP INT base. We have a two physical interface, we have loopback. So definitely as per the process, first it will check manually, then it will go for the loopback IP address. If you have multiple loopback IP address, highest IP address of the loopback will become a router ID. Clear? चलो check करो, right? Show IP protocol. See, still I have an old router ID. Why? No. See, because you already formed the neighborship. You already formed the neighborship. Now your neighbor know your router ID. So OSPF all of a sudden will not go and change your router ID. You have to clear IP OSPF process, or you have to reboot your router. Then only your newly created loopback become a router ID. Clear? Right? Still I have a router ID 1.1.1.1, which is the highest IP address of active interface. Okay, go to the router 2 and look for a neighborship. Show IP OSPF neighbor. No change. Do one thing, WR main and clear IP OSPF process. So what will happen? It will clear the IP OSPF process. It will start from the beginning. Enter. Let's check the message on the router too. See, IP OSPF neighborship, and then on the router one see show IP protocol. Still not in effect. Let me check the interface status. Show IP anti brief. Up. Loopback address 1.1.1. Okay, no problem. Sometimes it's an emulator, right? So sometimes it take time. Reload, confirm, and let's see what will happen. In the time, do one thing. Let's create a on the router 2. Let's create a multiple loopback IP address. Interface loopback 0 IP address 2.2.2.2 255.255.255.255. Okay, then no shutdown. Configure one more sub interface and one more loopback interface. One IP address is 2 dot IP address 2.0.0.2, then 255.255.255.255, correct, and no shutdown. So currently guys, how many sub IP loopback interface do you have? So we have a two loopback interface, one having 2.2.2.2 and 2.0.0.2. So which one is the highest? 2.2 is the highest. So this router IP address should be the router ID. So let's see any impact. Show IP protocol. Okay. So no, see guys. Now after reboot, I can see neighbor ID 1.1.1.1 on the router 2. Okay. So show IP OSPF neighbor. See, for router 2, now router 1 is the neighbor and having a router ID 1.1.1.1. Okay, fine, no problem. So after reboot, okay. But yes, definitely it should change after clear IP OSPF process. I don't know why it was not in effect. Show IP protocol. Perfect. Now you can see your new elected router ID. Go on router 2 and just W1 reboot the router. Once you reboot the router, what will happen? Reload command. Reload command. What will happen? Your loopback 0 will become a router ID because it has a highest IP address 2.2.2.2. Clear? Okay. Now next step. See, show IP protocol. Okay. See now the newly selected router ID is 2.2.2.2. Highest IP address of loopback interface. If you have a more than one loopback, right, or multiple loopback address. Okay. Show IP OSPF neighbor two-way bit. Then on the router 1, show IP OSPF neighbor. Okay, see now on the router 1 I can see to the 2 as a neighbor ID of a router 1. Now do one thing. The first step is a manually. Let's now configure the manually and let's see what will be the effect. Right. Router 1, currently router 1 router ID is 1.1.1.1. Okay, so let me change manually. ROUTER router OSPF 10 and command is router ID. Router ID 1.1.1.11, which is my router ID. Okay, then WR main. Now administrator has configured manually. Show IP protocol. See, manually, as soon as you configure the manual router ID, it take in effect immediately, right? Okay, no problem. So do one thing on a router 2, configure it manually. Router 2 ROUTER router OSPF 10, and under this router OSPF 10 process configure the router ID 2.2.2.22. Oh, 22. Okay, so now this should be your router ID, IP protocol. See, 2.2.2.22 is now your router ID. But it is changed locally, or your neighbor router also aware about your router ID. Okay, let's see. Show IP Ospf neighbor. Yes, now I can see the new neighbor ID. So now when you configure loopback when you configure the router ID manually, no need to reboot or no need to clear the IP OSPF process. Clear? Right? So we make sure what is the sequence. Let's review quickly. Router ID is a 32-bit IP address. It will be selected by the OSPF router. First step, election process manually. If administrator configured it manually, so that become a router ID. If manually is not there, then it will look for a loopback IP address. If you have a multiple loopback address, the highest IP address of the loopback interface become a router ID. And the third is highest IP address of the active interface become a router ID. Clear? Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye.